July 1st, 1916, 7:32 a.m., Thiepval Spur. 5 miles of guns have hammered this ridge for a week. Over 1 million shells. At 0 hour, whistles. By 7:30 a.m., men moving in lines. By nightfall, one number will fix itself to the day. 57,470 British casualties. The fortress they expected to storm was ahead. The fortress that broke them was below. The word dugout understates what the German army built under the Western Front by mid-war. A dugout was not a foxhole, not a hasty scrape in the dirt, not a simple shelter. It was a roomed space cut into chalk or clay, timbered and shored, often floored, sometimes wired, sometimes lit. It was the hidden infrastructure of a defensive system that learned to live under modern fire. If a trench was a line on a map, a dugout was the volume behind it, a cube of time carved out beneath the earth so that men could survive an artillery storm and reappear at the moment a clock demanded. By August 1914, the German army already used shelters in forward lines, but the first winter taught both sides the same lesson. Wooden walls and a roof were not enough. High-explosive shells collapsed shallow cover. Mines ate cellars. Water seeped into everything. In 1915, German pioneers, specialist engineer units, scaled up what had been improvised. The term was Stollen, a drive into the earth with dogleg approaches, where chalk was firm, galleries extended. Where clay was heavy, shafts were lined. Where sand or the water table threatened, the design changed. In the coal fields of northern France, experience from mines came straight into military practice. Pit props, rails, ladders, pumps, ventilators. Materials moved forward on light rail lines under cover of night. Skilled labor, pioneers, miners, prisoners of war, requisitioned civilians, was allocated by sector priority. A shelter might begin as a niche and end as a warren. Depth was the difference between life and death. A 2-meter recess spared you from splinters. A 6-meter chamber shrugged off a medium shell. 8 to 12 meters of earth, 20 to 40 feet, could save a company under a hurricane bombardment. The deeper you went, the steadier the air, the safer the phone, the drier the ammunition. By 1916, on the Somme high chalk, German front line and immediate support trenches were studded with vertical shafts dropping to deep rooms with bunks, stoves, tables, and telephones, each connected to company command and artillery observers. Some had electric light from dynamos turning in the rear, current carried forward on cable. Where you expected mud, there were numbered bunks. Where you expected a sapping stink, there was vented air and a brazier, and always a second way out, because collapse was not a hypothetical. The plan behind the wood and the clay was an idea. Let artillery spend itself. The German army did not win the Somme in July 1916. It survived it. Survival was the point. A strong point was not measured by how beautifully the parapet was built or how straight the trench line ran. It was measured by how many men could be hidden 6 to 10 meters down, then brought up quickly to a firing step the instant the barrage walked forward. A stopwatch mattered as much as a machine gun. The mathematics were brutal and simple. If a British field battery lifted off the front trench at H minute and crept forward at, say, 50 to 100 yards per minute, and the attackers had 200 yards of no man's land to cross, then 4 minutes after the lift, the first waves would be reaching the parapet. If a German garrison needed 2 minutes to climb from the dugout to the trench, the margin for survival was in seconds. Buildings on the surface made soldiers feel safe. Rooms under the surface made them actually safe. At 7:33 a.m., that British corporal at Thiepval reaches a landing where the stairs dogleg again. He turns his headlamp, looted from a sapper, toward a door. The stenciled letters on canvas read, "Gas Schluss," gas lock. 2 flaps create a small antechamber so contaminated air cannot rush in when the door opens. Inside, a table with a field telephone, a handset neatly hung, a slate with names. The bed frames are numbered. Shelves hold entrenching tools and coiled wire. The impression is not luxury, it is order, an ordered absence of panic. On the table lies an envelope with a code sheet. No one is inside. He shines his light down the next flight. Another door. Another turn. He decides he has gone far enough and begins to climb back up. Above ground, the infantry are learning in real time what the fortress below means. When the British barrage lifted off the German front line that morning, many German companies were still intact, shaken, deafened, some entrances blown in, some galleries cut, but garrisons alive. Their officers had heard the lift on the surface like a physical release, earth breathing out. Runners woke men. Ladders jammed with bodies. Machine guns were manhandled back up a stair or a sloped shaft and swung onto the parapet. When the first British waves came near, the line, struck dumb by hours of noise, found its voice. The notion that the line had been crushed by weight of shell died in the space between two whistles. The Allied view would harden into a phrase: German dugouts were like underground fortresses, because on the surface the trenches could be taken, but the position could not be held. When the first line fell, garrison after garrison surged up from below, brought ready ammunition from carefully labeled shelves, and used the crossfire of undestroyed machine gun posts to slice across the captured trench. The second German line had its own deep shelters. The third line had reserves, timed to move as soon as telephone lines confirmed attacks and artillery observers identified the lifting pattern of the enemy barrage. Underground spaces turned a flat landscape into a layered one. The Allies had superiority in gun count in sectors, but the Germans had superiority in depth of survival. Go back 1 year, September 25, 1915, Loos. The first large British offensive on the Western Front put thousands of men across fields near Lens in a dawn mist. The preliminary bombardment was heavy for the British Army of 1915, but many shells were shrapnel, more suited to anti-personnel effects in the open than to breaking deep cover. The front line could be taken. What could not be held were the strong points linked by covered galleries to rearward dugouts. German barricades were rebuilt from behind by men who had not been obliterated because they had not been there when the shells fell. The dugout principle, hold your strength underground, let the barrage pass, counter from depth, was already visible. In 1916, it matured. By July 1916 on the Somme, German defensive sectors bristled with named redoubts: Schwaben, Thiepval, Zollern, Leipzig, each a knot binding trenches, machine gun posts, and dugouts into a time-resistant mass. A redoubt could be silent while the ground above it boiled. Then, almost at once, it came alive. British infantry who fell into these positions reported an uncanny sensation. The enemy seemed to materialize from the earth itself. Machine guns opened from embrasures that had looked dead. Mortars appeared at corners. A voice shouted from a shaft. For attackers conditioned to believe that weight of shell equaled control, the reversal was devastating. They had expended weight. The Germans had bought time. Depth brought other advantages. Communications survived. A dugout with a protected shaft for cable meant the company commander of a battered garrison could still speak to his battalion and to the artillery liaison. When the line needed a protective curtain of fire 10 minutes after lift, the request could go through a network that had not been ripped up by shrapnel or splinters. When the British advanced their guns onto new positions, German observers, themselves sheltered, could direct counter-battery fire onto those positions. This is how an underground room, dark, timbered, cramped, could have strategic effect miles away. It kept the nerve system of a defensive organism intact. Construction methods reflected geology and priorities. In Picardy and Artois, where chalk was firm, shafts could go deep and rooms could be cut with relatively little shoring. In Flanders, where the water table rose close to the surface, deep dugouts flooded. There the German army shifted, less vertical depth, more concrete on the surface. Low concrete blockhouses with narrow slits, what Allied soldiers would call pillboxes, sprouted across the wet front in 1917. To attackers, these too felt like fortresses because they had the same function as a deep dugout. They sheltered men from the storm until it passed. Shelter first, fire second, counter-move third. The form changed because the ground dictated the form. The function did not change. But on dry high ground, the German Stollen proliferated. A typical forward dugout might have a main shaft with a ladder, a dogleg to break blast, and two rooms, one for a squad, another for company headquarters. The rooms had bunks in tiers, heavy timbers overhead, a central post, and boards on the floor where boards could be spared. In better appointed strongpoints, there were stoves with flues carried up to side trenches and capped with grills to disperse smoke. Many had pumps to keep the lower level dry, sump pits in corners, covered buckets to serve as latrines, and shelves for candles, tools, and grenades. Entrances were sometimes disguised in traverse corners. The white chalk from a new shaft was carried away at night. The deeper the room, the more it could be wired for power if power lines were present. Electric light was not universal, but where it existed, its effect was not comfort but order. Men could read orders, write coordinates, check maps, lay out fuses. That order under pressure was part of the fortress feel. Step back and ask, how could an army under blockade build so many rooms under so much ground? The answer is logistics. In 1916 and 1917, the German army concentrated timber forward in massive quantities, pit props cut from occupied forests, billets of softwood, rails from sidings, corrugated iron sheets, steel H-beams where high priority demanded. Narrow-gauge lines ran thousands of meters forward to nightly dump points. Working parties moved up with pioneer units, working in rotation to shaft, shore, and fit out. A sector with a high expectation of attack, intelligence from prisoners, aerial photos of new enemy battery positions, the sound of wheels at night, received materials and labor. A sector expected to be quiet, made do. The fortress feel was not uniform. It concentrated where German command chose to survive. By April 1917, at Vimy Ridge, the Canadian Corps attacked on a front where both sides had used the chalk to go under. The Canadians drove assault tunnels, mines, and subways forward to move troops and supplies unseen to the jump-off line. The German defenders had their own deep shelters just back from the crest, cut into the ridge's soft stone. When the Canadian attack rolled in, under a tightly coordinated barrage and in sleet, many German forward garrisons were still alive in their rooms. But now the Allied system had shifted. Wire was cut not by random fire, but by a graze fuse designed to explode on contact with wire. Counter-battery fire had been plotted in advance by silent methods, using sound ranging and flash spotting, so enemy batteries could be suppressed from the opening minute. And crucially, the tempo was different. The Canadian infantry moved in smaller packets, hugging a predictable curtain of fire, trained to clear strong points methodically and to push past shelters before garrisons could coordinate a counter-move. Deep dugouts could still buy time. The Canadians learned to buy less of it for the defenders. June 7, 1917, Messines Ridge, Flanders. 19 mines detonated under German positions, each the product of months of tunneling under the enemy. Where the water table made deep dugouts impractical, the German army had used reinforced shelters and shallow galleries. The British and Dominions went deeper still, undercutting the entire geometry. The explosions erased the strong points themselves. You could build a fortress underground. A bigger underground could still demolish it. Again, form and ground together set possibilities. A few months later, at Passchendaele, water was sovereign. Deep dugouts drowned. Concrete ruled the topsoil. Attackers advancing over platforms of duckboards faced a mosaic of pillboxes whose function, preserve men from the barrage, then pour fire, echoed the earlier stolen logic. To a man crawling on his belly in August 1917, a low concrete hut spewing fire felt the same as a timbered room from which men suddenly appeared. The psychology was constant. Here the inversion becomes clear. The British and French had assumed at the start that firepower alone would make lines untenable. The German army assumed that survival would buy options. Survival required depth. Depth required organization. Organization required engineers, materials, and doctrine. The doctrine that emerged, often summarized as elastic defense, did not depend on unbroken parapets. It depended on resisting at multiple layers, retreating from places that were death traps, concentrating at points that mattered, and always having troops alive to contest ground the instant a barrage stepped off. The fortress, then, was not a wall. It was a schedule married to a shelter. Watch it minute by minute on a typical attack day in 1916 to 1917. Minus 30 minutes, German frontline garrisons, already reduced to sentry groups, go down into dugouts, taking machine gun crews to intermediate positions under cover. Minus 10, the heaviest shelling is falling on expected strong points. Telephone lines that are exposed are cut, but the lines run under cover to deeper nodes survive. Runners sit, sleeves rolled above elbows, faces gray with chalk dust, waiting at bottom landings for orders to carry forward. Minus 1, barrage lifts off the front trench. Silence shocks men who have been under noise for hours. H. Whistles blow in opposing lines. H+1. German sentry groups from forward fall back down, communication trenches connected to shafts. Machine gun crews climb. H+3. First attacking waves cross halfway. German fire builds as crews shake out belts, mount tripods, sight weapons. H+5. Defenders artillery, warned by phone or prearranged plan, lay down defensive fire belts in front of the trench line. H+10. Survivors in dugouts farther back begin to move forward by covered routes to counterattack any lodgment. H+30. If the attackers have not pushed beyond the first trench to seize the support line and carve up the dugout exits, a local counterattack is likely to retake whatever sap or bay they reached. The clock is the fortress's outer wall. From the Allied perspective, entering a captured German dugout was an uncanny breach of that wall. Reports from the Somme through Arras and into Flanders describe the same features with small variations: the tight angle of entry to break blast, the heavy timber crossbeams, sometimes stamped with a sawmill's mark, the central support post, the double canvas curtains that made a gas lock, the telephone table with a list of call signs, the rack of rifles labeled by section, a brazier with a pot and a neat pile of fuel, and on occasion a small dynamo crank handle or the residue of insulated cable for lighting. There were placards, Ruhe for quiet, Kein Licht for no light at night, Achtung Gas near the curtains. There were nails driven into posts with tags for helmets and respirators. There were lists of rations and grease-penciled tallies on doors. This orderliness led to a bad shorthand, like hotels, because there might be a mirror or a stash of wine. But the truth was simpler. They were machines for not dying. Not every dugout looked like a fortress. Many were cramped, filthy, rat-ridden, flooded. A shaft blocked by a single heavy shell became a tomb. A stove mishandled filled a room with carbon monoxide. A collapse after rain sealed exits until the surviving men clawed through with their hands. The underground protected but barely comforted. It was also costly. Timber had to be hauled. Engineers had to be spared from other tasks. Men spent nights underground working when they might have slept. Every minute, an infantryman held a saw under a ground sheet to mask the sound. The overall system still held, but at a price. And yet the effect was consistent. In sector after sector, Allied soldiers who took a trench realized quickly that they had not taken the position. The enemy who had seemed to vanish had retreated down a stair. The enemy who reappeared with belt-fed weapons at the lift-2 minute had lived through the heaviest fire in rooms somewhere below. The enemy who counterattacked carried grenades up-labeled shelves in a place where labels survived. The memory of that first descent into a captured dugout stuck. You felt the thickness of the ceiling by the quiet. You saw the plan in the placement of a table and a handset. You understood that you had been facing not merely men and guns, but a system that ran from a spade's edge to a general's map. The ultimate proof came in winter 1916 to 1917, when the German army executed Operation Alberich, the deliberate withdrawal to the new Siegfriedstellung, the Hindenburg Line. It was not only a retreat, it was a re-siting of the fortress. As front lines shortened and straightened, new positions were built with concrete shelters, deep cellars, steel-framed dugouts, and more room for reverse-slope positions that hid from direct line-of-sight fire. The line ran from near Arras past St. Quentin towards Soissons, and behind it, switch lines, fallback lines, communication trenches, ran a belt of prepared depth. German engineers took the lessons of the Somme and Verdun and poured them into ground. More cover, deeper cover, more deliberate sighting, more phones. Attackers in 1917 found that even when the front trench could be rushed under improved barrages, the true fight began where men rose from places not touched by shell. The Allies adapted. They did not solve the fortress with courage, they solved it with systems. Artillery methods changed first. Predicted fire replaced registration chutes that had previously told the enemy an attack was coming. Sound ranging and flash spotting plotted enemy batteries so they could be suppressed at 0 hour rather than answered in kind later. New fuses caused shells to burst on contact with wire instead of burying themselves before exploding. Heavy howitzers and trench mortars targeted dugout mouths and known shaft heads. Infantry training shifted towards small unit tactics that emphasized clearing a trench, then breaking the links that let a dugout feed it. Sappers learned to blow entrances with a monal and to toss grenades down shafts and listen for quiet. Tanks, where ground allowed, rolled over the parapet and ignored traverse geometry. Their value was not only armor, but speed through the timing wall. Barrages were planned to linger or to double back. The creep acquired pauses and surges designed to catch men halfway up a stair. This arms race of time versus depth had a climax in 1918. On March 21st, German stormtroops attacked in fog across the Somme in Operation Michael, having themselves refined infiltration tactics and reorganized artillery for shock. Now German troops came forward under the cover of their own schedule, using light machine guns, rifle grenades, and flamethrowers to bypass strongpoints and seek command posts and guns. They had dug while the Allies had dug. They had learned while the Allies had learned. The fortress below them, shelters and reserves, supported the initial shock. When the offensive spent itself weeks later, the positions traded back and forth again. In summer and autumn, the Allied 100 Days attacks used massive, precisely organized artillery, tanks on firm ground, and air reconnaissance to crack positions that no longer had the reserves to counterattack effectively from dugouts. The system faltered when there were not enough men left to ride the staircase up and down on schedule. Zoom back to the micro scenes that teach what the macro means. Ovalers, July 1916. A mortar team, faces gray with chalk, stands in a low room shuffling bombs along a shelf that the bombardment could not touch. La Boisselle, same day. A second entrance collapses. The garrison uses the emergency exit clawed months earlier with a list of names posted near it and a mark beside each when the man passes up. Pozières, August. Australians clearing a captured trench are halted by fire from a traverse. They find the shaft entrance tucked behind a clipped gas curtain. A grenade goes down, a pause, then the scramble of men up and out waving handkerchiefs. Arras, April 1917. A British platoon, using the city's ancient chalk quarries to move unseen, pops out near a German support line and finds an entrance that should have been a secret. The door is smashed with a pick. Someone says the room looks like a railway office because of the telephone and the lists. Vimy, the same month. Canadians, trained to move on compass bearings behind a carefully timed curtain of explosions, pass a shaft mouth without entering. They will let the mopping up parties take it. Messines, June. A strong point vanishes and with it its rooms. Passchendaele, October. A blockhouse that is not a dugout but has the same function of a fort heaves under shell strikes and then opens its embrasure like a mouth to spit fire across a field where water stands in shell craters. Cambrai, November 1917. Tanks roll on ground hard enough at last, bypassing entrances that had dominated summer fields of mud. German infantry counterattacks in waves from places that survived the initial strike because they were below it. The phrase felt like underground fortresses, stuck because of contrast. Allied trenches could be primitive in forward zones, dominated by the fact that an attacker lives at the surface. Allied soldiers rotated through lines that had less time to be built to the same depth because operational plans demanded movement forward, not the perfection of a fixed line. When they stumbled into German positions that had been tuned for months to survive, the difference was visceral. Clean timbers, lined shelves, labeled bunks, a working phone, these were not decorations. They were signals that the enemy had built for the storm you just tried to create and had expected to live through it. The awe was not about comfort, it was about intention. The intention was to render your firepower into a schedule they could beat. The moral is not that one side knew masonry and the other did not. It is that subterranean infrastructure is strategy in slow motion. In trench war, space and time are traded. A dugout trades space, volume excavated for time, minutes survived under shell to create an option, men on a firing step at the right second. Machine guns and mortars realize that option. Phones and runners coordinate it. Reserves move along communication trenches and sunken roads to complete it. When attackers learned to bend the time curve by keeping a barrage longer, by moving faster, by cutting off entrances, the option shrank. When defenders could not maintain depth because materials and men ran short, the fortress thinned. There are costs that rarely make it into tactical diagrams. Living underground for days at a time degraded men. The stress of waiting under shelling with no relief but the certainty of the stare was its own kind of terror. Carbon monoxide, cave-ins, gas seepage through soil, these killed quietly. The subsoil hosted rats in biblical numbers. In winter, water and ice turned steps into hazards. Men broke ankles going up to a firing step to be killed minutes later. Engineers died in collapses before an attack ever came. The fortress extracted lives even when it saved them from shells, but the effect on battle was unmistakable. Compare figures across 1916. In sectors where German dugouts were deep and numerous, the ratio of attacking casualties to defending casualties widened. Compare sectors where geology prevented depth. Defenders suffered more from bombardment and had less to bring to the parapet when the lift came. Compare 1916 to 1918, where Allied methods suppressed artillery and moved quickly on a predictable but unrelenting clock. Defenders' dugouts could not feed the line fast enough to restore it. The pattern is consistent. Under shell, you either die on the surface or live under it. If you live under it, you fight. If you fight on time, you can hold. Now return to the opening image. The corporal at Thiepval pushes back up the stairs and emerges into a blast of air hot with cordite and dust. The trench he left is no longer empty. Men in field gray are on the firing step, a machine gun on its mount, a corporal beside it shouting a range. Where did they come from? He can answer the question now. They came from inside the earth. They came from a room with a table and a phone that survived a week of iron. They came from a plan that said, do not be where the shells are, be where the enemy is, at the minute he is there. History often hides in physical things. A plank, a cable, a curtain stamped with a warning. The fortress of German dugouts was not a castle buried under chalk. It was a collection of details that made survival systemic. Not the glamour of a fortress, but the function of one. Not imposing walls over ground, but calculated depth under it. That is why Allied troops remembered the shock of the first descent, not because they envied comfort, but because they encountered a logic. The conclusion fits in one line. The German dugout turned artillery supremacy into a timing problem, and for 2 years the defenders often solved it. Epilogue. After the war, some stolen were dynamited, some flooded, some stripped. Farmers plowed fields that hid rooms. Boys found timbers and wire in copses where a shaft had been. Decades later, a storm would open a hole at a field's edge and a timbered staircase would stare back out of the soil, the gas curtain long rotted away. The space below is quiet now. The fortress has no purpose without the clock above. But to those who stood on trench lips between 1915 and 1918, the lesson remains exact. Not through flamboyant surface, but through invisible depth. Not through heroic presence, but through planned absence. Not by being seen, but by being there at the right second. The earth was not just ground to fight over. It was the armor that let men fight at all. Silence for a beat, then only the ticking of a watch that no longer rules a battlefield.